You are listening to Chthonia, the podcast of the Dark Feminine. Chthonia's logo was designed by J.R. Malpair. Background music is Phantasm by Kevin MacLeod. Hello and welcome to Chthonia. I am your host, Breach Burke, and in our continuing series on the Das Mahavidyas in Hindu mythology, particularly in Tantric mythology, today we're going to discuss Bhairavi today. Now, Bhairavi is, again, like all of them, she's a fairly complicated figure who has to do with both creation and destruction. As a Mahavidya, we tend to sort of focus on her more ferocious form, which is more destructive. Now, Bhairavi is often seen as the consort of Bhairava, who is, or Kala Bhairava, which is another form of Shiva. And I'll talk a little bit about Bhairava, just so you can get kind of a sense of, those characteristics that Bhairavi is said to be a partner to, or they refer to her as a consort, which is true. But I think she is also, as we have talked about, being a Shakti of these particular deities. So this is another Shakti of Shiva in a particular form. Okay, so I'm gonna describe her and describe who she is. There's really three Bhairavis. Okay, there's a cosmic Bhairavi, there's a destructive Bhairavi, and then there's another Bhairavi who's described in many forms. Many of them very sexual in nature. Okay, so I want to talk about these different aspects and how they come together in spite of their maybe apparent contradictoriness. There's an interesting a connection between them. And I feel like we can go back and look again at our questions that we have about the divine feminine. One of the questions I initially had when I started this podcast is, why is the feminine so scary to people? Why is the idea of a divine feminine? Why does it have to be in kind of this chaste and obedient form? Like, why do we feel women's sexuality has to be so much under control? And I feel like when we look at goddesses, we looked at Chinnamasta, and now we're looking at Bhairavi. I think we may start to get some kind of an answer as to what is so fearful. Okay, but first, let's go back and talk about who is Bhairavi. Okay, now she's one of the Mahavidyas, as I've mentioned, and her name means terror or awe-inspiring. Okay. And like I said, there are different forms of her. There are frightening forms, and there are very beautiful forms. Bhairavi is also the title used for a Tantric adept. If you're a female Tantric adept, is known as a Bhairavi. So that's, and I think that might become obvious as to why they would have that title as we go on. Now, the aspect of Bhairavi that is a consort of Bhairava is known as Tripura Bhairavi, or I think it's usually pronounced Tripura Bhairavi, and that she's said to reside in the Muladhara chakra, which is the base chakra, the one at the very root. So she is associated with with our basest instincts, and that kind of makes sense when we start to think about some of her attributes. She's both has to do with maybe survival, okay, because the Muladhara is very much connected with survival and perhaps has a very intense and almost violent energy, but it is also the root of sexuality. So, so she would basically be at the very, very base of the spine, the base of the Kundalini, its beginning point. And not where usually the female sexual center is, which of course, as I mentioned, I think I think it was one on Matangi. It was either Matangi or Chinnamasta, but I know I mentioned that the female sexual center is in the Swadhisthana chakra, which is just above the Muladhara. So it's a little bit different. Okay. So here's a description of her. It said, she is seated on a lotus with 4 hands, one with a book, one with rosary beads, one with Abhaya Mudra, and another with Varada Mudra. She wears red garments and wears a garland of severed heads around her neck. She has 3 eyes, and her head is adorned with a crescent moon. In another form, she is carrying a sword and a cup containing blood, and 2 other hands showing abhaya and varada mudras. She is also depicted as sitting on Shiva, which is more predominant in Tantric worship. Yes, the woman is always on top in Tantric worship. Something to think about, too, when we think about the Lilith myth, not to digress, but just to kind of tie some of these threads together. I think that's rather interesting that, the divine feminine, these powerful dark feminine figures are the ones that are on top. She is also depicted as a queen, closely resembling Rajeshwari, who is another highly revered tantric goddess. So she has this, and of course Rajeshwari means sort of like, queen among queens, if you will. Sorry, I'm having my tea. I'm on a kind of a green tea kick right now, so forgive me if I have to stop for, now and again. Okay, so when we look at Bhairavi and we look at her in, sort of her background, the etymology of the name, and this has more to do with, as I mentioned, there are 3 Bhairavis. There's a cosmic one, there's a destructive one, and there is a this other one that's said to have 12 forms. Okay, she has more forms. All the Mahavidyas have multiple forms, but she has more than any of them. And and those tend to be more sexualized in nature. So, when we think of sex, now sex, again, is not entirely about creation. We know that. It's also about pleasure. It's about a lot of other things. But if we think about sexual energy as creative energy, it's sort of the opposite of destructive energy. But yet the 2 of them really work in tandem. In a way, it's not really that they're opposites, but more like 2 sides on the same coin. Now, here's an etymology of Bhairavi. That says that she controls the changes taking place in the universe. The Mahavidyas represent the role of Adi Parashakti in the world. Tripura Sundari represents creation. Bhuvaneshwari symbolizes the sustainability of the created universe. And Kamala represents prosperity and evolution. The other Mahavidyas display the various processes that take place during the period of the universe. In this continuous cycle of creation and destruction, Bhairavi represents knowledge and civilization. She symbolizes the modifications of the universe by mankind and the progress of humans and detailed studies. Now, this would make her akin to Saraswati, who is the goddess of knowledge, but also Bhairavi has a lot of associations with speech, which would also make her akin to Shiva. There is a myth of Shiva that I don't know if I've mentioned. There's a wonderful thing called the Maheshwara Sutras. There's a wonderful recording. I think it's Pandit Jasraj is the one that I've recording that I have of that. But the idea is that the world, when the world is created, everything is in silence, and things come. Then Shiva creates, the Sanskrit alphabet, which is actually the Maheshwara Sutras are actually a recitation of the Sanskrit alphabet. And those are the divine syllables that sort of create the world, that give the world form and difference. You know what I mean? And make it into the world that it is, and not just a formless kind of silent place. And so Shiva, and of course, and usually there's the crashing of thunder, because the idea that the thunderbolt also, breaks up and creates the sound. Certainly in Hindu thinking in general, sound is very, very important in terms of, the vibrations of the universe. Plato has a very similar idea about when he talks about like the harmony of the spheres and things like that. The idea of sound as being fundamental to the frequency or vibrations of the universe. This is why mantras recitation is so important, because reciting the mantras creates a change in the energy around you. It's not just a bunch of stuff that you say. I mean, it actually does something to modify the environment, especially if recited over long periods of time. So she has to do, so in that sense, she has to do with, you could see the relationship to Shiva and to Saraswati, who is the goddess sort of knowledge and intellect and civilization. So there's a connection there with that. Now, as far as her origins, I prefer very heavily I rely very heavily on David Kinsley's tantric visions of the divine feminine, mainly because it's one of the only like sort of comprehensive scholarly works out there on this subject. Not that there aren't others that are out there, but his seems to be the most, at least in one of the most complete scholarly surveys to this point. Now Kinsley, let me just take a look at my notes from Kinsley here. What does he say? Yeah, he has, he says he has difficulty finding any kind of an origin myth, which he finds unusual. But he does mention the Sharada Tilaka, which is a 9th century text, and has a hymn of praise to Bhairavi. And I'll read that to you. This has to do with the cosmic Bhairavi. You are so subtle that the gods cannot describe you. You are the source of the world and have no beginning. You have 3 eyes, a beautiful face, and 4 hands in which you hold a book and a rosary, and with which you make the signs of assurance, giving favors. You are the source of speech, of everything graceful, the source of the universe itself. You wear the moon as a crest in your hair and have a white complexion like the autumn moon. You hold a jar of Amrita, immortality nectar, and make the gesture of exposition and teaching. When Shiva and Vishnu are worshipped, you are there to be worshipped as well. You are also Brahma, where speech abides. You are the nature of consciousness. You control the vital air, and by granting yogic powers, you defeat the 6 kinds of passions: sexual lust, greed, delusion, intoxication, jealousy, and anger. Shiva, having obtained half your body in his half-man, half-woman form, it's a side note, was then empowered to create the world. The world cannot be created without you. After worshipping you, the wives of the Siddhas, or heavenly beings, become red-eyed because of drinking too much wine. They sing your names along with the Kinnaras, the heavenly beings, other heavenly beings. We worship you who, as the coiled serpent, the Kundalini, goes to the city of Shiva after passing along the Susmana Nadi, making all the lotuses bloom, which of course is an allusion to the rising of the Kundalini. We worship you who are bathed with a flow of nectar. You are the source of all Vedas. Your form is consciousness itself. You are the creator of the world and the form of sound and meaning. You maintain the world by your power as the sun, and you dissolve the world in your form as fire. Narayani, Gauri, and Saraswati are also your names. Okay, so this has more to do with her, again, her cosmical aspect. And her kind of role as kind of there's definitely a suggestion there that behind these sort of this male triad of Brahma, Vishnu, and Shiva, that there's an implication that Bhairavi is the force that's behind that. And of course, yeah, if she's the coiled serpent of the Kundalini, we talked about that with Chinnamasta as well, as the copulating couple, and then her head sort of being blown off. At least that's one way to look at it. But the idea of the power of the Shakti. So Bhairavi, the fierceness of her, it's this creative fierceness. Okay. So it's interesting. I want to talk a little bit about her association with Kundalini Shakti, just as with all of these, because that's where I feel the key is to why people feel feminine power needs to be controlled, even though this concept does not exist in the West, okay? We see it in other related mythologies. We see it in the mythologies of, as I mentioned, Lilith. You see it in the mythologies of perhaps even to some degree Medusa, the snake-haired woman. You might see it in the mythology of there's the sense that, I'm just trying to think, of course I had another thought and it just kind of left my head. There's basically, when we see that certain goddesses like Hecate, for instance, who start out by Hesiod as being like, absolutely, she's worthy of praise by Zeus, she's, nothing is taken from her after the battle with the Titans because she's so wonderful, she's celestial, she's this and that. And then, as time goes on, she first becomes the gatekeeper of the moon of the underworld, and then she becomes this evil, like, witch figure. So we see the way in which, that way energy is interpreted, let's put it that way. The idea of this feminine power, this power that resides on top sexually, and this Kundalini Shakti, which is extremely, extremely powerful, and I think, as I've said before, is not to be underestimated either in your individual body or as a collective concept. I mean, Kundalini Shakti is very, very powerful. It's like being hit by lightning. It's very potent. So, so there's, so one can understand there's a reason to say, okay, yeah, you want to be careful with that. You want to respect that. Obviously, it's something very creative, but it can also be something very destructive. So you have to be careful. And the way that kind of ended up being in the West is, we need to subjugate that and, beat it down and put it under our control, like everything else in nature, right? Because we have control over nature, right? Yep, that's why we, why we deal so well with these virus outbreaks and these other things. Anyway, sorry, I'm just a little aside right now. I'm actually recording this somewhat early, and I'm like coronavirused out. I'm hoping that by the time this particular episode goes live, we're not even talking about it anymore. So, but just the idea that we think we have so much control over nature, and we actually don't. So, okay. So there's this identification with that. Now what we just described was the cosmic Bhairavi, okay? So let's talk a little bit about, her destructive form. And I'm going to refer to Kingsley again for that. Okay. One scholar interprets Bhairavi as a female version of Shiva in his destructive form as Kala Bhairava, in which he punishes people both living and dead. He notes that Kala Bhairava is closely associated with Yama, Lord of Death, who lives in the south, and they say this is why Shiva is also known as Dakshinamurti, whose form faces southward. Kala Bhairava's consort, he says, is Tripura Bhairavi, or Tripura Bhairavi, as I've heard it pronounced, who is constantly occupied with destroying the three worlds, hence her name, she who is fierce in the three worlds. Okay. Now this is interesting. Okay. Tripura Bhairavi arises or becomes present when the body declines and decays, which is a natural, inevitable, and irresistible force. They said she's also evident in self-destructive habits such as eating tamasic food and drinking liquor, which wears down the body and the mind. Hey. Sorry, I'm not. People who know me privately know I'm not actually known for being the healthiest person in terms of eating habits in the world. But by the same token, I don't know. I'm not going to say anything about that. Anyway, so anger, jealousy, and other selfish emotions strengthen Bhairavi's presence in the world. Righteous behavior, conversely, makes her weaker. In short, she's an ever-present goddess who manifests herself in and embodies the destructive aspects of the world. Okay, now that's interesting. So she's kind of a goddess, again, like these other ones, like Matangi, like, Chinnamasta. They represent forces that are antisocial in a way. They are not about, these are the forces of destruction, not the forces of creation. But obviously they still have an important place. Okay? And that's something that's kind of hard to understand. We talk about regulating excess, which of course is a fine and very rational and sensible thing to do. But this presence of Bhairavi, she sort of embodies that, but at the same time, as I said, she embodies all of these other positive creative things, which again suggests to me that all of these attributes somehow work together. We tend to separate and we tend to sanitize. We want to say, oh, well, one must always engage in righteous behavior and avoid, these other things. But I'm like, should you? I mean, you don't want them to, rule your life, because if they get out of balance, they'll destroy your life. Just kind of like the concept of the demonic in Hinduism. It's like, okay, the demons are given as much a right to exist as the gods, and they may even be granted boons from the gods, who are considered superior. But it's when they get out of control that they're a problem. Not when they're just, doing their thing. And that's kind of true of a lot of these energies. It's an interesting way of looking at this play of energies in the world, which really, at base, doesn't have any morality to it at all. It's more in the way that we interact with it. Now, the whole business about her being involved with the decaying body makes me think immediately of the Greek concept of psyche, or psyche. And, because what the Greeks believed was that when the person died, okay, what left your body was the psyche, which is the breath of your life. That leaves your body, and that what's left behind that goes to the underworld is the eidolon, or kind of this kind of weakened shadow. But the vitality of you, the psyche, is something that disappears with your last breath. And interestingly here, Bhairavi, who represents the Kundalini Shakti, which is your consciousness force, it's the power force in the body. that if it leaves you, she is, she is that force that, that deals with the decaying body. And then, of course, when that is gone, now there is the concept of Jiva in Hinduism, the idea of the Jiva that can be, well, I think Jiva Atman is kind of part of the whole system. But I know that there are prayers that are done when the person dies to keep them from turning into Jiva, which would mean almost being like a ghost or being sort of ghoulish or coming back and praying. Again, very reminiscent of Greek and Roman practices or ancient practices of appeasement of the dead. That this is, or the idea that the dead had to follow the proper rites so that you did not leave the soul in that kind of suspended state. So I just think it's interesting, her association with what I think of as the psyche, the pure consciousness of life, which you see in Greek mythology and in Greek thinking about death. So somewhat interesting there. Now, as a Mahavidya, Bhairavi, again, her name means the fierce goddess. She's a female version of Bhairava, who is, and I'll talk a little bit about Bhairava. But just to finish this, Bhairavi is of a fiery volcanic red complexion with 3 furious eyes and disheveled hair. Her hair was matted and was tied up in a bun decorated by a crescent moon as well as by 2 devil horns sticking out from each side. She has 2 protruding tusks hanging out from the ends of her bloody mouth. She wears a red and blue garments and is adorned with a garland of skulls around her neck. She also wears a belt decorated with severed hands and bones attached to it. She is also decked with snakes and serpents, too, as her ornamentation. Looks a lot like the other Mahavidyas, right? Rarely is she seen wearing any jewelry on her limbs. She has 4 hands, 2 of which are open and 2 of which hold a rosary and a book. Now, a rosary in this case is a mala, as I said, the Rudraksha mala that one recites their mantra with. And and of course the book, that's her connection there to speech and to learning and to civilization. And the snakes and the serpents, just like with the Chinnamasta, which I don't know if I even mentioned that in the episode, but the serpent connection is certainly relates to the life force and the Kundalini. As Joseph Campbell's noted, the serpent is usually positive in most cultures. In the West, we have tended to associate the serpent with something that is negative. The serpent, the tempter of in the garden, right? Who's really Satan or Samael or something like that. It also gets tied up in the Lilith myth, by the way, in the I think it's in the Midrash, right? But in any case, it's in Jewish texts. Lilith is she's either the serpent or she's in cahoots with the serpent. Okay, so that's again 2 very interesting views of this kind of force, this kind of feminine force. Because on the one hand, Bhairavi is sort of, she is this, but she's also considered to be a very beautiful and a very creative goddess. She's something, she's honored in her own way. She's seen as the consort of Bhairava. Now, let me just say something quickly about Bhairava here. Bhairava originates from the word biru, which means fearful. Bhairava means terribly fearful form. It's also known as the one who destroys fear or one who is beyond fear. This is just basic Wikipedia I'm taking from right now, by the way. One interpretation is that he protects his devotees from dreadful enemies, greed, lust, and anger. Bhairava protects his devotees from these enemies. These enemies are dangerous as they never allow humans to seek God within. There's another interpretation. Ba means creation, Ra means sustenance, and Va means destruction. Therefore, Bhairava is the one who creates, sustains, and dissolves the 3 stages of life. Therefore, he becomes the ultimate or the supreme. Okay, but Kala Bhairava is generally Kala again means time, and so there's the idea of the destroyer of time, which would certainly give it a link to Kali as well. But Kala Bhairava in one story, here's the origin story that Wikipedia repeats from another source. The origin of Bhairava can be traced to a conversation between Brahma and Vishnu, which is recounted in the Shiva Mahapuranam. In it, Vishnu inquired of Brahma, who is the supreme creator of the universe? Arrogantly, Brahma told Vishnu to worship him as supreme creator. One day, Brahma thought, I have 5 heads. Shiva also has 5 heads. I can do everything that Shiva does, therefore I am Shiva. Brahma became a little egotistical as a result of this. Additionally, he began to forget the work of Shiva and started interfering in what Shiva was supposed to be doing. Consequently, Mahadeva, which is another name for Shiva, threw a small nail from his finger which assumed the form of Kala Bhairava and casually went to cut off one of Brahma's heads. The skull, Kapila of Brahma, is held in the hands of Kala Bhairava. Brahma's ego was destroyed and he became enlightened. From then on, he became useful to himself and the world and deeply grateful to Shiva. In the form of the Kala Bhairava, Shiva is said to be guarding each of these Shaktipeeth, the Shakti temples. Each Shaktipeeth is accompanied by a temple dedicated to Bhairava. Okay? So, so another version, I don't want to get too much off track on Bhairava, but there's another school of thought that says Shiva himself created Bhairava. There was one demon Dahurashuran, who got a boon that he could be killed only by a woman. Kali was invoked by Parvati to kill him. The wrath of Kali killed the demon. After killing the demon, her wrath metamorphosed as a child. Kali fed the child with her milk. Shiva made both Kali and the child to merge with him. From this merged form of Shiva, Bhairava appeared in one of his 8 forms. Since Bhairava was thus created by Shiva, he is said to be one of the sons of Shiva. Okay, so, so again, he has this sort of destructive force. He's seen with a drum, a noose, a trident, and a skull. Okay, and some forms there are more than 4 hands. He appears without dress and with a dog. His weapons, the dog, protruding teeth, terrifying looks, and a garland with red flowers give him a frightening appearance. Okay, so Bhairava is considered to be the consort of, Bhairavi is considered to be the consort of Bhairava, and we have seen her discussion there. Now, last thing I want to talk about, at least in terms of these forms, is, I'm going back to Kinsley here, where he talks about the many forms of the goddess, and he mentions the Tantra Sara describes 12 separate forms of Bhairavi, and taken together they suggest a multifaceted goddess who is not limited to being the embodiment of destruction. As Sampaprada Bhairavi, she gives riches. As Sakala Siddhi Bhairava, she is the one who grants every perfection. As Bhaya Vidvam, some of these I should have practiced these. Bhaya Vidvamsini, okay, just trying to put that together 12 times fast. Bhairavi, she destroys all fears. As Chaitanya Bhairavi, she gives awakened consciousness. As Bhuvaneshwari Bhairavi, she is present in creation and engenders growth. As Kameshwari Bhairavi, she kindles sexual desire and grants sexual gratification. As Anapuneshwari Bhairavi, she gives food. These last, he says, okay, the last 2 forms, he said, deserve comment as they present such a strong contrast to the destructive aspect. Okay, so this is Kinsley again, page 172. He goes on to say, Kameshwari devotes a form of Bhairavi who is mistress of Kamadeva, the god of sexual desire, namely Rati, whose name means sexual intercourse. And remember, we saw Kama and Rati in the imagery for Chinnamasta. As Kameshwari, she embodies sexual desire and lends to creation in its distinctive quality of being pervaded by the mutual attraction of the sexes. One of her dhyana mantras, that of Sampaprada Bhairavi, says she is intoxicated with her youth, and most descriptions of her, despite her associations with destruction, say that she is attractive, young, and shapely. Bhairavi's association with sexual desire and fulfillment is mentioned often in her 1,000 named hymns. In the Shakta Paramoda, for example, she is she who is fond of semen and menstrual blood, she who is worshipped by those who worship with semen. In her 1,000 named hymn, the Vishvasara Tantra, she is called Lovely One, she whose form is semen, she who produces semen, who gives love, who enjoys sexual intercourse, who is dear to Kama, and who dwells in the yoni being the vagina or vaginal area. Okay. So very interesting. All these different forms of her, and they're not what we would expect from a goddess who we associate with the destruction of everything or the decay of the body. Or does it? One of the things that I've thinking about here. Okay. It's there's this, one of the things I think we can see as we've been looking at the different Mahavidyas and their aspects is that they tend to have what we would think of as auspicious and inauspicious traits. They're all related to both creation and destruction. Their forms generally involve garlands of skulls or heads, necklaces of arms, and limbs. They're standing usually sometimes on a copulating couple, or at least on a god. They always, they have a sword. They have something fierce about them, like either having tusks or fangs or horns or something like that. Their hair is always described as disheveled, but at the same time, it's they all seem to have serpents wound around their feet or their neck or something. They always seem to be associated with serpent imagery as well. So, in these sort of complex Shakti forms, they can be quite terrifying, but they also can be quite fascinating and beautiful. And if we think about sort of that fine line between attraction and repulsion, if it were, we become sometimes we're fascinated by things that might otherwise be considered repulsive. But they have to do with these kinds of forces, not only that are in us psychologically, but also that are just embodied in nature. And it's interesting to reflect that in the West, the way that this has been translated in mythologies of very similar figures that we've talked about, your Lilith figures, your Ishtar figures, and so forth, they have they're not they're seen as evil. They're seen as demonic in the West. These are forces that need to be expelled or exiled or brought under control or brought into obedience. Or there's a sense of these are or something to be conquered or crushed. And that's kind of worth thinking about. Like this is kind of our attitude towards the feminine in its power. The feminine that like Lilith resides on top. That in the way that it is in Tantra. Even, like I said, even in traditional Hinduism, Tantra is not considered to be, that's kind of like people, if you tell a pious, Brahmin Hindu that you're interested in Tantra, they probably don't want anything to do with you after that, or they probably just think, oh my God, you know what you're involved in. And because you are dealing, it's like you've got the fork in your hand and you're near the electrical outlet. You got to be really careful what you do there. There's a lot of energy. So I think on an energetic level, in the same way that we funnel things like electricity for useful purposes, having our internet connections and, having our electricity to have things run and charge our phones and, have the electricity and the heat in our house and, lighting and all that stuff. There's a tremendous amount, that, if I kind of compare it to a sort of an electrical power, nonetheless, you don't want to handle that electrical power. You don't want to go to a power plant and, open up a live wire and, that's why they tell you to stay away from live wires, right? It's a force, but that doesn't make it an evil force. It just means it's something extremely potent and needs to be handled very carefully. And it's sort of interesting that the way that the masculine has developed in our culture is to actually just like, it's kind of like our approaches to purity, in this culture too. It's like, okay, when anything comes that seems like it might be the form of disease or decay, we have to like kill it with, let's kill it with everything we've got. Let's all take 8 million antibiotics and like sanitize the hell out of ourselves. And it's like, there's this sense of like, we need to, there's definitely a sense in the West. You see it in the Roman religion too. I mean, keep the pollution away from me. Probably in pagan days, there was a lot more respect for that. Again, in the form of ancestor worship and appeasement and, we still want the cemetery outside the community, but, but nonetheless, we still want to show respect because we don't want you to come back and do bad things to us. Okay. That's the way they're talking about, because death, obviously, that's when that force is now released and, now it's a problem because it's kind of like, okay, if that also is not properly controlled in death, it can, that energy can still be problematic if it's sort of, allowed to kind of fly loose. And you notice that the gods, who are the ones who seem to dominate in most mythologies, are the ones who have access to the thunderbolt. Indra is king of the gods in Hinduism, and he's got, that's his thing, he's got his thunderbolt. Zeus is like that. Yahweh is like that. Yahweh is was a thunder god. That was his sort of original role, was as a storm god. And so the storm, that's considered to be the power and the potency, and again, lightning is associated with so many things, and with such a certain kind of a power, and that power is probably akin to the power that we see in the Kundalini Shakti. But Kundalini Shakti, like I said, that's really potent stuff, and to awaken your own Kundalini is to kind of give you a power that, polite society isn't necessarily, actually it is something that would allow you to live up to your potential, to be a very creative person. Again, if done in the right way, you want to make, there is a sense of like, if it's just kind of uncontrolled, that you might, you run the risk of doing psychological damage to yourself and maybe even physical damage. So so there's a certain sensibility, and we want to be careful with this. As you're dealing with these forces. How do we deal with them effectively? But at the same time, that doesn't mean this is a force we should be working with, not a force that we should be trying to suppress. And I feel it's the suppression of that force that creates the kind of like really toxic masculine-feminine splits that we have in our culture. Women are only allowed to be this, men are only allowed to be this. Men are not allowed to, do anything expressive of the feminine because, God forbid, they, you show something like that, and therefore they're full of this kind of energy, but they're terrified of it and don't know what to do with it, and they take their terror out on the women around them or on society around them. People who surround themselves with guns and with all kinds of things, because it's like, what are you afraid of? And that's the question I kind of continually get back to. What is it that you're afraid of? And in looking at these goddesses, who to me, and again, I've said this before, I don't want to be repetitive, but I have said, one of the things that really appeals to me about Hinduism is it seems to be a really, really accurate model of how psychologically and energetically the world works. If you look at these stories and you look at these images, they're metaphors, they're complex metaphors. They don't, when we start getting into trying to look at mythology, it's like, oh, well, what's the history behind that? Did this thing really? No, it didn't really exist. The reason they look so crazy is because they're trying to say these are not forces like you. These are not people. These are representations of something that is just mysterious, beyond us, and extremely powerful. So, we need to kind of be thinking of it in those terms, and I feel that the Hindu myths beautifully express this. They're perfectly express this, this particular, this sort of what we consider to be paradoxical, or what the force is and what it looks like, and something to think about. I'm always trying to continually to get people, especially people who come from Western backgrounds, to think differently about what you've been taught. Don't take for granted what you've been taught. You've been taught a version of things, and that version tends to be dominated, very masculinely dominated. It's about control. It's about, which can be fine. I mean, control to a certain degree is fine. Repression's another thing. These are things that we can take to an extreme in a means of trying to, it's like all those zombie movies where, they're about to storm the gates and climb over, and people are trying to protect themselves. You can't, you cannot quarantine yourself away from, from life, creation, from those aspects of life. Okay. And you really shouldn't. This is part of the experience of being alive. So with that, I think I'm going to stop for today. I think we're probably, let me see, how many Mahavidyas have we done so far? We've done Kali, we've done Matangi, Chinnamasta, so forth. Not quite halfway through, but at the next one. And then, of course, we're going to want to talk about the Matrikas. So a bit to go here, but I'm hoping that this is going to be an exploration of the divine feminine, maybe one you're familiar with, maybe you're not. Maybe even if you practice traditional Hinduism, you might not be quite as familiar with some of these things. But definitely worth looking at and thinking about and trying to understand, why this is so important and why we need to acknowledge, in our way of thinking and our way of being, these forces and how they operate. And instead of trying to be afraid of them and fight with them, we need to embrace them. Men who embrace that divine feminine are probably going to be very, very powerful men. Because they are men who are not afraid of their feminine side. Okay, and that's another thing. There's another food for thought for you guys out there. Okay, so with that, I want to say thank you again for listening. I will have some more updates coming up. Please check out patreon.com/Chthonia if you are interested at all in, becoming a patron. I do have certain things. I mean, patrons get a first crack at the podcast when it comes out. Plus, there's some other perks and benefits that that I put out as things get done from time to time, depending on what level of contribution. So check that out. Like I said, Chthonia.net, which is the home site of this, still in progress. Like I said, I will have updates on social media and everywhere else when I have that, ready to go. And beyond that, I just want to say thank you to my patrons again. And thanks to all who are listening. Thanks to my bunch of YouTube subscribers, by the way. It's like, wow, the numbers are going way up on YouTube. Not quite enough to mean that I can live comfortably on advertising income, but nonetheless, I'm extremely appreciative that more and more people are subscribing. So if you like it and you think your friends will like it, tell your friends. And hopefully, I'll continue to provide content that interests you. And with that, I will say till the next episode. Goodbye.